Welcome, everyone, to a story about imagination, perseverance, and magic. Today, we explore the remarkable life of Walt Disney, a man who taught the world that dreams really do come true. A farm boy's beginning. The morning sun painted the Chicago sky with shades of pink and gold on December 5th, 1901, in a small, modest apartment on the second floor of a wooden building. Flora Disney held her newborn son. She named him Walter Elias Disney. Outside the window, horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestone streets. Factory smoke drifted into the cold winter air. The city was loud, crowded, and growing rapidly. Walt was the fourth son born to Elias and Flora Disney. His older brothers, Herbert, Raymond, and Roy, were already running through the apartment, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. A few years later, his younger sister Ruth would arrive, completing the family of 7. When Walt was 4 years old, his father made a bold decision. Elias had grown tired of city life, tired of the noise and the crowds. He wanted fresh air and open spaces for his children. So he bought a small farm in Marceline, Missouri, a quiet town where church bells rang on Sunday mornings and neighbors knew each other's names. The Disney family arrived in Marceline on a warm spring day. The farmhouse was simple, white paint peeling in places, a wide front porch with creaking wooden boards, and windows that rattled when the wind blew. Behind the house stretched 45 acres of land, with fields of corn swaying in the breeze and an old red barn that smelled of hay and animals. For young Walt, the farm was paradise. He would wake up to the sound of roosters crowing at dawn. Golden sunlight would stream through his bedroom window, dust particles dancing in the beams. He spent his days exploring, climbing apple trees with branches that stretched toward the sky, wading in the cool creek water that bubbled over smooth stones, and watching clouds drift across the endless blue Missouri sky. Walt fell in love with the farm animals. There was a horse named Charlie with a gentle brown eye and a swishing tail. There were chickens that pecked at the ground, their feathers ruffled by the wind. And there was a pig Walt named Porker, who would grunt happily when Walt brought him food scraps. Every evening, Walt would sit on the back porch with a pencil and paper. The wooden boards were still warm from the afternoon sun. He would draw everything he saw, the way Charlie's mane flowed in the wind, the curve of a chicken's beak, the round shape of Porker's belly. His Aunt Margaret noticed his talent and gave him a big drawing pad and a box of colored pencils. Walt treasured these gifts more than any toy. But farm life wasn't easy. Elias Disney was a strict father with calloused hands and a weathered face. He believed children learned through hard work. Every morning before the sun rose, when the sky was still dark purple and stars still twinkled overhead, Walt and Roy had to wake up and help with chores. They fed the animals, milked the cows, and collected eggs from the hen house, their breath making little clouds in the cold morning air. Despite the hard work, Walt found magic in those Missouri mornings. He loved watching the sunrise paint the fields gold and orange. He loved the smell of fresh-cut grass and the sound of birds singing their morning songs. These memories, the small-town peace, the friendly neighbors, the simple beauty, would stay with Walt forever. Early struggles and first lessons. In 1910, when Walt was 9 years old, dark clouds gathered over the Disney family's happiness. Elias had caught typhoid fever and was too weak to work the farm. Bills piled up on the kitchen table. The family couldn't afford to keep the farm anymore. They moved to Kansas City, Missouri, a bustling city with tall brick buildings, streetcars clanging on metal tracks, and streets filled with people hurrying to work. The Disney family settled into a small house with thin walls and cramped rooms, a sharp contrast to the wide open spaces of the farm. Elias bought a newspaper delivery route. Every single morning at 3:30 a.m., when the world was still dark and silent. An alarm clock would shatter the peace. Walt and Roy would drag themselves from their warm beds into the freezing cold. Winter mornings were the worst. Ice formed on the inside of windows, and their breath came out in white puffs. The brothers would load heavy bags of newspapers onto a wooden cart. The papers smelled of fresh ink and made their hands black. They walked through empty streets, their footsteps echoing off brick buildings. Sometimes snow fell, covering the sidewalks in white blankets. Sometimes rain poured down, soaking them to the bone. But they delivered every paper to every doorstep before the sun came up. After deliveries, Walt would trudge to school, his eyelids heavy with exhaustion. He sat at his wooden desk in the back of the classroom, where winter sunlight streamed through tall windows. The teacher's voice seemed far away. Walt would fight to keep his eyes open, his head nodding forward until he jerked awake. But school had one bright spot: art class. The classroom smelled of paint and chalk dust. Sunlight illuminated the drawings pinned to the walls. Here, Walt came alive. He drew cartoons of his teachers, the stern-faced principal with his bushy mustache, the kind math teacher with her wire-rimmed glasses. His classmates would gather around his desk, laughing at his funny drawings. One day, his teacher noticed him sketching during a lesson. She walked over, her shoes clicking on the wooden floor. Walt braced himself for punishment. Instead, she picked up his drawing, a cartoon of President Lincoln, and smiled. "This is wonderful, Walt," she said, holding the drawing up for the class to see. "You have a real gift." Those words planted a seed in Walt's heart. Maybe his drawings weren't just scribbles. Maybe they meant something. When Walt was 14, he enrolled in night classes at the Kansas City Art Institute. The building was an old mansion converted into a school, with high ceilings and chandeliers that cast warm light on the hardwood floors. After his evening newspaper route, Walt would rush to class, his art supplies clutched under his arm. The classroom was filled with older students, men and women in their 20s and 30s, serious about becoming professional artists. Walt was the youngest, still a boy among adults, but he sat in the front row, his eyes fixed on the instructor. The teacher was a thin man with paint-stained fingers and intense eyes. He taught Walt about perspective, how to make flat drawings look three-dimensional, about shading, how light and shadow gave objects depth, about proportion, how to capture the correct size and relationship of objects. Walt absorbed every lesson like a sponge. He filled sketchbook after sketchbook with practice drawings. At home, late at night, he would sit at the kitchen table under a single hanging light bulb, drawing and redrawing until his hand cramped. One evening, the instructor pulled Walt aside after class. Through the window behind him, street lamps glowed in the dark Kansas City night. "Walt," the teacher said, his voice serious, "you have genuine talent. I've seen many students come through here, but few have your dedication." He paused, his eyes meeting Walt's. "But talent alone isn't enough. The world is full of talented people who gave up when things got hard. You need to work harder than everyone else. You need to never, ever give up. Can you do that?" Walt nodded, the teacher's words burning into his memory. "Yes, sir, I promise." He never forgot that promise. World War I and a young artist. The year 1917 brought dark changes to America. War raged across Europe, and the United States joined the fight. Newspapers showed photographs of soldiers in trenches, of battlefields scarred by bombs. Walt's older brothers enlisted in the military, putting on olive green uniforms and marching away to war. Walt was 16, still too young to join the army, but he couldn't sit safely at home while others fought. He heard about the Red Cross Ambulance Corps, which would accept volunteers as young as 17. So Walt did what many desperate young men did. He forged his mother's signature on the permission form, claiming to be a year older than he was. In the fall of 1918, Walt sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. He stood on the ship's deck, watching America disappear behind him. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, gray water meeting gray sky. The ship rocked and swayed, making many soldiers sick. But Walt spent his time drawing, sketching his fellow volunteers, capturing the endless waves, practicing his art even as he sailed toward war. France was unlike anything Walt had imagined. The countryside was beautiful in places, rolling green hills, stone villages with church steeples, vineyards stretching toward distant mountains. But the war had torn ugly scars across the land. He saw burned buildings, their blackened walls standing like broken teeth. He saw cratered fields where bombs had exploded. He saw young soldiers with haunted eyes and bandaged wounds. Walt drove an ambulance, a boxy vehicle that smelled of gasoline and medicine. Inside, wounded soldiers lay on stretchers, their faces pale with pain. The roads were rough, full of potholes that made the ambulance bounce and shake. Walt drove carefully, trying not to cause the wounded men more suffering. But Walt being Walt, he couldn't leave his ambulance plain and dull. During his free time, he painted cartoon characters all over it, funny faces, silly animals, cheerful scenes. The other soldiers thought he was crazy at first. Then they saw how the wounded men smiled when they saw the decorated ambulance. How, for just a moment, the cartoons helped them forget their pain. Walt also drew portraits for soldiers. He would sit in the barracks at night, a cold stone building with thin mattresses on metal beds, and sketch. By candlelight, he captured the faces of young men far from home. He drew pictures they could send to their families, images that said, "I'm still alive. I'm still me." One night, a soldier approached him. The young man had bandages wrapped around his head, and his hands shook slightly. "Can you draw something for me?" he asked quietly. "Of course," Walt said, picking up his pencil. "Draw me before this," the soldier said, pointing to his bandaged face. "Draw me the way I used to be, the way I want my girl back home to remember me." Walt drew the soldier as he asked, young, whole, smiling. When he finished, the soldier stared at the drawing with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "You gave me back myself." That moment changed something in Walt. He realized that art wasn't just about drawing pictures. It was about touching people's hearts, about bringing light into darkness, about giving hope when hope seemed lost. When the war ended in November 1918, soldiers celebrated in the streets. Church bells rang across France. People embraced and cried with relief. Walt stood in the autumn sunshine, watching the celebration, and made a decision. When he returned home, he would dedicate his life to bringing joy to people through his art. The road to animation. Walt returned to Kansas City in 1919. He was 18 years old, full of dreams but empty of pocket. The city looked the same: brick buildings, crowded streets, streetcars running on their tracks. But Walt had changed. He had seen the world. He knew what he wanted to do. He found a job at Pesman Rubin Commercial Art Studio, a company that created advertisements. The office was on the second floor of a building downtown, with large windows that let in streams of morning light. Desks lined the room, and the air smelled of ink, paint, and paper. Walt sat at a wooden desk near the window, drawing advertisements for newspapers and magazines. He created pictures of soap, shoes, farm equipment, whatever the clients wanted. The work was steady but uninspiring. Walt dreamed of creating his own art, not just selling products for others. At the studio, Walt met a young man named Ub Iwerks. Ub was thin and quiet, with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers. But when he drew, magic happened. His lines were clean and perfect. His characters came alive on paper. The two young artists became instant friends. During lunch breaks, They would sit on the building's fire escape, eating sandwiches and talking about their dreams. Below them, the city hummed with life, cars honking, people talking, shop doors opening and closing. "I don't want to draw soap advertisements my whole life," Walt said one day, watching clouds drift across the blue Kansas City sky. "Me neither," Ub agreed, adjusting his glasses. "We should start our own company." That conversation, on that fire escape, changed everything. In January 1920, Walt and Ub opened their own business, iWorks Disney Commercial Artists. They rented a tiny office, just one room with peeling paint and a single window. They bought 2 desks, some art supplies, and a sign for the door. They were entrepreneurs, businessmen, independent artists. They were terrified and excited in equal measure. The first week, they waited for clients. They sat at their desks, listening to footsteps in the hallway outside, hoping each one would stop at their door. Very few did. The second week brought the same disappointment. And the third. By the fourth week, their small savings were gone. They couldn't afford rent. They couldn't buy food. iWorks Disney Commercial Artists closed after just 1 month. It was Walt's first business failure, but certainly not his last. Walt and Ub both found jobs at the Kansas City Film Ad Company, a larger advertising firm. The office was in a bigger building with more employees and steadier work. But this job gave Walt something that would change his life forever, his first glimpse of animation. The company created short animated advertisements for movie theaters. Walt watched, fascinated, as still drawings were photographed one frame at a time. When played quickly, the drawings appeared to move, to dance, to jump, to come alive. Walt was mesmerized. He had found his calling. Every night, after everyone else went home, Walt stayed behind. The office grew quiet and dark except for the single lamp at his desk and the glow of the animation camera. Outside the windows, the city lights twinkled like earthbound stars. Walt taught himself animation through trial and error. His first attempts were terrible. Characters jerked awkwardly across the screen. Movements didn't flow. Timing was off. But he kept trying, night after night, learning from each mistake. He would arrive home after midnight, exhausted but exhilarated. He would fall asleep with animation principles running through his mind: timing, spacing, anticipation, follow-through. He dreamed in moving pictures, laughogram films, dream and disaster. In May 1922, Walt made a bold decision. He was 20 years old and ready to run his own animation studio. He rented a small office space in downtown Kansas City, 2 rooms on the second floor of an old building. The rooms had high ceilings with peeling paint, wooden floors that creaked, and large windows that let in afternoon sunlight. Walt named his company Laughogram Films. He hired a small team of young artists, including his friend Ub iWorks. They were all in their late teens or early 20s, young, talented, and full of energy. They crammed into the small office, their drawing boards lined up side by side, working long hours to create short animated fairy tales. The office buzzed with creative energy. Jazz music played on a phonograph in the corner. Animators called out jokes to each other as they worked. Stacks of drawings covered every surface. The smell of ink and paint filled the air. Walt created modern, jazzy versions of classic fairy tales: Little Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, Jack and the Beanstalk, and Cinderella. The cartoons were clever and charming, with expressive characters and smooth animation. Local theaters showed them before the main features, and audiences loved them. Children laughed. Adults smiled. Walt's dream seemed to be coming true. But Walt made a critical mistake. He focused entirely on creating quality cartoons and forgot about the business side. He didn't chase down clients who owed him money. He spent more money than the studio earned. He poured every penny back into making the cartoons better instead of paying bills. By early 1923, Laugh-O-Gram Films was drowning in debt. Creditors knocked on the door, demanding payment. The phone was disconnected. The electricity was about to be shut off. One by one, Walt had to let his employees go. He couldn't pay them, couldn't even afford to pay himself. Walt ended up living in the office, sleeping on a couch with worn cushions and broken springs. He ate cold beans straight from the can because he couldn't afford a hot meal. The office grew cold at night. He huddled under a thin blanket, watching his breath make clouds in the moonlight that streamed through the windows. He wasn't entirely alone. A family of mice lived in the office, coming out at night to search for crumbs. Walt would watch them scurry across the floor, their tiny feet pattering on the wood. He even befriended one, a little mouse with bright eyes and quick movements. Walt would share his food with the mouse, grateful for the company. Late at night, sitting in that cold, empty office with only a mouse for companionship, Walt faced the darkest moment of his young life. He was 21 years old, bankrupt, alone, and defeated. Most people would have given up on their dreams right there. Walt sat at his drawing board one final night, moonlight casting shadows across the room. He looked at all his drawings scattered around the office, the fairy tale characters, the practice sketches, the failed attempts. He remembered the soldiers in France, how his drawings had made them smile. He remembered his classmates laughing at his cartoons. He remembered audiences enjoying his films. He made a decision. He would try one more time, but not in Kansas City. He would go to Hollywood, California, where the movies were made. He would start fresh. In July 1923, Walt packed his one suitcase with his few belongings, some clothes, his art supplies, and a can full of drawings. He wore his only suit, threadbare and out of style. He had exactly $40 to his name. As the train pulled out of Kansas City Station, Walt pressed his face to the window. He watched the city fade into the distance, watched the Missouri countryside roll past, fields of corn swaying in summer heat, farmhouses with smoking chimneys, endless blue sky stretching overhead. He was leaving behind his failures. He was heading toward his future. He didn't know if he would succeed, but he knew he had to try. The train rolled west, carrying Walt Disney toward his destiny. Hollywood dreams and harsh realities. The train journey to California took 3 days. Walt sat by the window, watching America pass by, the flat Kansas plains giving way to Colorado mountains with snow-capped peaks, then the desert Southwest with its red rock formations and endless sand. Finally, the green valleys of California with orange groves stretching toward distant hills. Los Angeles in 1923 was a city of contrasts. Hollywood Boulevard bustled with activity, movie theaters with marquees lit by hundreds of light bulbs, restaurants with red leather booths, shops selling the latest fashions. Fancy cars drove down palm tree-lined streets. Movie stars in elegant clothes sipped coffee at outdoor cafes. But Walt didn't see that glamorous Hollywood. He went to his brother Roy's small apartment in a rundown neighborhood. The building was stucco, painted a faded yellow, with metal fire escapes zigzagging up its side. Inside, Roy's apartment was tiny, just a bedroom, a small living room, and a kitchen not much bigger than a closet. Roy was recovering from tuberculosis, a lung disease that had left him thin and weak. But he welcomed his little brother with open arms. The brothers shared the small apartment, sleeping on narrow beds and eating simple meals of soup and bread. Walt spent weeks trying to break into the movie business. He walked up and down Hollywood Boulevard, his worn shoes clicking on the star-studded sidewalk, going from studio to studio with his portfolio under his arm. At each studio, the answer was the same. A secretary would look at his animation samples, her lips pursed, then shake her head. "We're not interested in cartoons," they would say. "Animation is for children. It's not real art." It won't make money. Door after door closed in Walt's face. Some days, he would return to the apartment as the sun set, casting long shadows between the buildings, and slump onto the couch in defeat. Roy would make them dinner, usually just pasta with tomato sauce, and encourage Walt to keep trying. "You're talented, Walt," Roy would say, ladling soup into chipped bowls. "Someone will see that eventually." One hot August afternoon, Walt sat on a bench in a small park near their apartment. Palm trees swayed in the breeze overhead. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the warm air. Walt watched them and thought about his failed company in Kansas City, about his empty pockets, about all the rejections he'd received. But he also thought about those soldiers in France, about the mouse that had kept him company in his empty office, about his promise to never give up. That evening, Walt and Roy made a decision. If Hollywood wouldn't hire them, they would create their own studio. They would be independent, just like Lafo Graham. But this time, Walt would be smarter about the business side. They found a garage to rent, a small, cramped space behind a house on Kingswell Avenue. The garage smelled of motor oil and dust. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the wooden walls. There was barely enough room for 2 desks and an animation camera, but it was theirs. On October 16th, 1923, Walt and Roy officially founded Disney Brothers Studio. They had no employees, almost no money, and no guaranteed work. But they had each other, they had talent, and they had determination. Walt created a new series combining live action and animation, the Alice comedies. A real girl named Alice would interact with animated characters in a cartoon world. It was innovative and different, exactly the kind of thing that might catch Hollywood's attention. Walt found a distributor in New York willing to take a chance on the series. The contract wasn't generous. Walt would barely make enough to survive, but it was a start. It was hope. The garage studio hummed with activity. Walt animated at one desk, his pencil scratching across paper from dawn until long after dark. Roy managed the business side, keeping track of expenses in a worn ledger book. They hired a few assistants, cramming even more people into the tiny garage. Summer heat made the garage sweltering. Sweat dripped onto the drawings. In winter, they wore coats and gloves, their breath visible in the cold air. But they kept working, kept creating, kept believing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to improve. The Alice comedies found an audience. More theaters wanted to show them. Walt could afford to hire more artists, including his old friend Ub Iwerks, who moved from Kansas City to join the team. They moved out of the garage into a small storefront on Hyperion Avenue. The new studio had actual rooms with electricity and heat. Windows overlooked the street, where trolley cars clanged past. The walls were painted white, and natural light flooded the workspace. In 1925, Walt met a young woman named Lillian Bounds. She had been hired to ink and paint the animation cells, a tedious job that required a steady hand and infinite patience. Lillian had dark hair, bright eyes, and a gentle smile. She sat at a desk near the window, carefully painting each frame while afternoon sunlight illuminated her work. Walt found himself watching her, admiring how focused and graceful she was. He would make excuses to walk past her desk, to ask her questions about her work. Finally, he gathered his courage and asked her to dinner. They went to a small Italian restaurant with checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles. Over spaghetti and meatballs, they talked for hours. Lillian was kind and practical, with a warmth that balanced Walt's restless dreaming. She saw past his shabby suit and empty pockets to the brilliant, determined man beneath. They married on July 13th, 1925, in a simple ceremony in Idaho. They couldn't afford a honeymoon. Instead, they took the train back to Los Angeles and returned to work the next day. But they were happy. Lillian became Walt's anchor, his support, his partner in all things. For 4 years, the studio grew steadily. They produced Alice comedies, then moved on to a new character, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Oswald was mischievous and funny, with long ears and an infectious personality. The cartoons were successful. Walt felt proud of what he'd built. But he was about to learn a harsh lesson about trust and contracts. Betrayal and birth, the creation of Mickey Mouse. February 1928 was cold and gray in New York City. Walt had traveled east to meet with Charles Mintz, the distributor who handled the Oswald cartoons. Walt arrived at Mintz's office building, a tall structure in Manhattan with marble floors and brass elevators. Mintz's office was on the 20th floor, with large windows overlooking the city. Through the glass, Walt could see other skyscrapers stretching into the cloudy sky, their windows reflecting the gray light. The office was expensively furnished, leather chairs, a massive mahogany desk, oil paintings on the walls. Walt sat across from Mintz, excited to negotiate a better contract. The Oswald cartoons were popular. Theaters loved them. Walt thought he had earned a raise. But Mintz had other plans. He leaned back in his leather chair, a cold smile on his face. "Walt," he said, lighting a cigar, "I've been talking with your animators. Most of them have agreed to work directly for me. And I've checked your contract. Oswald belongs to me, not you." Walt felt the room spin. His heart pounded in his chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you have two choices," Mintz continued, smoke from his cigar drifting toward the ceiling. "Accept a lower fee to continue making Oswald cartoons, or I'll make them myself with your former employees. Either way, Oswald is mine." Walt sat in stunned silence. He had created Oswald. He had designed the character, developed his personality, made him beloved, and now someone was taking him away, stealing Walt's creation along with most of his staff. Walt stood up, his legs shaky but his voice firm. "No, I won't work under those terms." "Then you'll have nothing," Mintz said, shrugging. "No character, no staff, no work." Walt walked out of that office into the cold New York February afternoon. Snow began to fall, white flakes drifting from the gray sky. People in heavy coats hurried past him on the sidewalk, their breath making clouds in the freezing air. Walt stood still, snow collecting on his shoulders, feeling utterly defeated. He had failed again. At age 26, he had lost everything: the character he'd created, the employees he'd trained, the contract he'd worked so hard to build. That evening, Walt sent a telegram to his brother Roy and to Lillian. "Don't worry. Everything okay. We'll give details when I arrive." But everything wasn't okay. Walt boarded the train back to California with a heavy heart. For 3 days, he sat by the window, watching America roll past in the opposite direction, skyscrapers giving way to farmland, winter landscapes gradually warming as they moved west. Walt barely slept. He stared out the window at the passing scenery, his mind racing. He had learned a painful lesson: never let someone else own your dreams. From now on, he would control his own characters, his own creations. As the train rolled through the American heartland under star-filled skies, Walt began to sketch. His pencil moved across paper almost unconsciously, drawing round ears, a button nose, big eyes full of personality. He was creating something new, something that belonged only to him. By the time the train reached California, Walt had designed a new character, a mouse. A cheerful, optimistic mouse who would never give up, no matter what obstacles he faced. Walt wanted to name him Mortimer Mouse, but when he showed Lillian his sketches, she wrinkled her nose. "Mortimer sounds too pompous," she said, looking at the cheerful little mouse. "What about Mickey? Mickey Mouse." Walt repeated the name. Mickey Mouse. It was perfect, friendly, approachable, memorable. "Mickey Mouse it is," Walt agreed, smiling for the first time since the betrayal in New York. He didn't know it yet, but he had just created the most famous mouse in history. Sound, success, and Steamboat Willie. Spring of 1928 found Walt back in his studio on Hyperion Avenue, working with renewed determination. The studio was cramped and chaotic. Drawing boards covered every surface. Stacks of animation paper teetered in corners, and the constant scratch of pencils filled the air. Walt and his small remaining team, including the loyal Works, threw themselves into creating Mickey Mouse cartoons. They produced two silent films, Plain Crazy and The Gallopin' Gaucho. Mickey was energetic and optimistic, always getting into trouble but somehow bouncing back. But these silent cartoons couldn't find a distributor. The movie industry was changing rapidly. A revolutionary technology called synchronized sound was transforming cinema. The Jazz Singer, in 1927, had proven that audiences wanted to hear actors speak, hear music play, hear sound that matched the action on screen. Most animation studios were ignoring this change, continuing to make silent cartoons. But Walt saw an opportunity. "What if," he said to his team one afternoon, sunlight streaming through the studio windows, "we create the first cartoon with fully synchronized sound. Music, sound effects, voices, everything perfectly matched to the action." His team looked skeptical. Synchronized sound was expensive and complicated. They barely had enough money as it was. But Walt's enthusiasm was infectious. "It's risky," Roy admitted, looking at their meager budget books. "If it fails, we'll lose everything. And if it succeeds," Walt countered, his eyes bright with possibility, "we'll make history." Walt created a new Mickey Mouse cartoon specifically designed for sound, Steamboat Willie. The story was simple, Mickey piloting a steamboat and causing chaos. But Walt planned to fill it with music and sound effects that perfectly matched every movement. Creating synchronized sound was incredibly difficult. Walt and his team had to time each action precisely. Every footstep, every whistle, every musical note had to line up perfectly with the animation. They worked through spring and into summer, refining, adjusting, perfecting. Money ran out. Walt mortgaged everything he owned, his house, his car, even Lillian's jewelry. If Steamboat Willie failed, they would be homeless and bankrupt. The premiere was scheduled for November 18th, 1928, at the Colony Theater in New York. Walt couldn't afford to travel there himself. He stayed in Los Angeles, pacing the studio floors, waiting for a phone call that would determine his fate. In New York, a Sunday afternoon audience filed into the Colony Theater. The theater was elegant, with red velvet seats, golden balconies, and a high ceiling decorated with painted clouds and stars. People came to see the main feature, not particularly interested in the cartoon that would play first. The lights dimmed. The curtain rose. Steamboat Willie began. Mickey Mouse appeared on screen, standing at a ship's wheel. He whistled, and the audience heard the whistle, perfectly synchronized with his puckered lips. They gasped in surprise. As the cartoon continued, Mickey made music using various objects: a cat's tail as a crank, a goat's mouth as a phonograph, pots and pans as drums. Every sound matched the action perfectly. The audience burst into laughter. They had never seen anything like it. Animation that didn't just move, but sang, whistled, and made music. When the cartoon ended, the audience applauded, something that rarely happened for a cartoon. Back in Los Angeles, when Walt received the phone call reporting the audience's reaction, he felt tears of relief and joy streaming down his face. He had done it. He had created something new, something magical, something that would change animation forever. Steamboat Willie became a sensation. Theaters across America demanded to show it. Newspapers wrote articles about the whistling mouse. Children begged their parents to take them to see Mickey Mouse again and again. At age 27, after years of failure and struggle, Walt Disney finally had his first major success. But Walt wasn't satisfied. Success was just the beginning. Now he wanted to push animation even further. The 1930s, innovation and color. The Hyperion Avenue studio expanded rapidly. Success brought money, and money meant Walt could hire more artists, buy better equipment, and experiment with new techniques. By 1930, the studio had grown from a handful of people to over 50 employees. The building buzzed with creative energy. Animators hunched over drawing boards, their pencils moving in quick, confident strokes. Inkers carefully traced the drawings onto transparent celluloid sheets. Painters filled in the colors with tiny brushes, working under bright lamps. Walt walked through the studio every day, stopping at each animator's desk. He would look at their work, offer suggestions, demonstrate how a character should move by acting it out himself. He jumped, ran, made funny faces. His employees were used to seeing their boss behave like a child, and they loved him for it. Animation isn't just about moving drawings. Walt would tell his team during morning meetings. Sunlight would stream through the windows behind him as he paced and gestured. It's about creating life, about making audiences believe these characters are real, about touching their hearts. In 1932, Walt made another revolutionary decision. He would create cartoons in full Technicolor. Color film existed, but was expensive and rarely used. Most cartoons were still in black and white, splashed with simple tints. Walt signed an exclusive contract with Technicolor, betting everything on color being the future. He produced Flowers and Trees, a silly symphony cartoon that showed nature in stunning, vibrant color: red roses, blue skies, green leaves, golden sunlight. When trees and flowers danced across the screen in full color, audiences gasped in wonder. Flowers and Trees won the first Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film. Walt stood on stage at the award ceremony, holding his Oscar, bright stage lights shining down. He was 30 years old and felt like anything was possible. But Walt's greatest innovation was yet to come: the multiplane camera. This massive machine stood 3 stories tall in the studio. It held multiple layers of painted backgrounds and animated cells, each on a separate glass plane. A large camera pointed down from the top. As the camera moved, the different layers created an illusion of depth. Objects in the foreground passed by quickly, while distant backgrounds moved slowly, just like in real life. The first time Walt demonstrated the multiplane camera, his artists gathered around in amazement. The studio lights dimmed. The camera descended slowly through the layers of glass. On the screen, a forest came to life with stunning depth. Nearby trees seemed to rush past, while distant mountains moved slowly, creating the sensation of flying through a real forest. "This is how we make magic real," Walt whispered, watching the demonstration with tears in his eyes. Snow White, the Impossible Dream. One evening in 1934, Walt gathered his key artists in the studio's small theater. The room was dark except for the glow of cigarettes and the light from the projection booth window. Walt stood at the front, his face lit by the stage lights, his shadow stretching across the screen behind him. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice trembling with excitement, "I'm going to tell you about our next project. Close your eyes and listen." For the next hour, Walt acted out the entire story of Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. He played every character: the innocent Snow White, the evil queen, each of the 7 dwarfs with their distinct personalities. He sang songs. He showed fear when describing the huntsman in the forest. He wept when Snow White ate the poisoned apple. When he finished, the room was silent. Then one animator raised his hand. "Mr. Disney," He said carefully, "Are you planning to make a feature-length animated film?" "Yes," Walt replied simply. The room erupted in nervous chatter. A feature-length cartoon? 90 minutes of animation? It had never been done. Most people couldn't even imagine it being possible. "They'll call you crazy," Roy warned his brother later that night. They sat in Walt's office, the room dark except for a desk lamp casting a warm yellow glow. Outside the window, Los Angeles twinkled with lights. "A feature-length cartoon could bankrupt us." "Then we'll be bankrupt dreamers," Walt replied, smiling. "But I don't think we'll fail. I believe in this. Roy, I can see it in my mind. Every scene, every character. It's going to be beautiful." Production began in 1934 and consumed the next 3 years. The studio transformed into a factory of dreams. Animators worked day and night. The building lights stayed on until midnight, golden windows glowing in the dark Los Angeles night. On weekends, cars still filled the parking lot as artists came in to work extra hours. Walt was everywhere, supervising everything. He reviewed thousands of drawings daily. He acted out scenes for his animators, showing them exactly how Snow White should run through the forest in terror, how the dwarfs should walk with their distinctive gaits, how the queen should transform into the witch with sinister grace. The studio created over 2 million drawings for Snow White. Artists painted detailed backgrounds, dark, menacing forests with twisted trees and glowing eyes in the shadows, the dwarf's cottage with its warm, inviting interior lit by firelight, the queen's castle with its cold stone walls and eerie green glow. Money became a constant worry. The budget spiraled upward, $250, 000, then $500, 000, then over $1 million. Walt mortgaged everything multiple times. Banks refused to lend him more money. Hollywood insiders called the project Disney's folly and predicted it would destroy him. Walt's hair began to gray from the stress. He lost weight. Dark circles formed under his eyes. But he never considered giving up. Late at night, when the studio was empty and quiet, he would walk through the halls, looking at the drawings pinned to the walls, Snow White's gentle face, the dwarf's expressive eyes, the evil queen's terrifying transformation. "It's going to work," he would whisper to himself in the empty hallways, moonlight streaming through the windows. "It has to." The premiere that changed everything. December 21st, 1937, arrived with clear, cool California weather. Stars twinkled in the dark sky above Hollywood. The Carthay Circle Theater was lit up like a jewel, its round Art Deco tower glowing with lights. Searchlights swept the sky, crossing and recrossing against the stars. Limousines lined the street, dropping off Hollywood stars in elegant gowns and tuxedos. Photographers' flashbulbs popped like fireworks. Crowds gathered behind velvet ropes, hoping to glimpse celebrities. The air buzzed with excitement and expensive perfume. Walt arrived with Lillian, both dressed in their finest clothes. But Walt's hands trembled as they walked down the red carpet. His heart pounded in his chest. 3 years of his life, millions of dollars, the studio's entire future, everything depended on the next 90 minutes. Inside, the theater was breathtaking. Red velvet seats curved around the circular auditorium. Golden Art Deco designs decorated the walls. The ceiling was painted to look like a twilight sky. The audience, Hollywood's biggest stars, critics, executives, filled the theater with chattering conversation. The lights dimmed. The audience fell silent. The curtain rose. Walt sat in the back row, Lillian's hand gripping his tightly. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He could only watch as his dream appeared on the screen. The film began with Snow White singing, "I'm Wishing," at the castle well. Her voice was pure and sweet. The animation was so fluid, so lifelike. that she seemed real. Walt watched the audience more than the screen. He saw children's eyes grow wide with wonder. He saw adults lean forward in their seats, absorbed in the story. When Snow White ran through the dark forest, terrified and lost, the audience gripped their armrests. When the dwarfs appeared with their silly antics, laughter filled the theater. When Grumpy slowly warmed to Snow White, people smiled. Then came the scene Walt had worried about most: Snow White biting the poisoned apple and falling into her death-like sleep. The theater fell silent. Walt heard people crying, not just children, but grown men and women, tears running down their faces as the dwarfs wept over Snow White's body. When the prince awakened Snow White with true love's kiss, the audience cheered. When the end appeared on screen, the entire theater erupted in applause. People stood, clapping until their hands hurt. The applause continued for 5, 10, 15 minutes. Critics who had called it Disney's folly now shouted their approval. Movie stars dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs. Walt sat in the back row, tears streaming down his face. Lillian hugged him tight, both of them crying and laughing at once. He had done it. He had done the impossible. Success, war, and new challenges. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs became a phenomenon. It earned over $8 million in its initial release, an astronomical sum during the Great Depression. Lines wrapped around theaters. It played for months. Disney merchandise filled store shelves. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs became as famous as movie stars. The Academy Awards gave Walt a special Oscar, one regular-sized statuette accompanied by 7 miniature ones. When Walt accepted it on stage, he could barely speak. He looked out at the applauding audience, the bright stage lights making everything seem dreamlike. Success brought expansion. The Hyperion Avenue studio was bursting at the seams with over 600 employees. Walt needed more space. In 1939, he built a new studio in Burbank, a modern campus with multiple buildings, a theater, a cafeteria, and beautifully landscaped grounds with green lawns and flowering trees. The new studio churned out masterpieces. Pinocchio, 1940, featured stunning effects, the blue fairy shimmering with light, Monstro the whale creating massive waves, Pleasure Island transforming boys into donkeys in frightening detail. Fantasia, 1940, was Walt's most ambitious experiment, an anthology of animated segments set to classical music. The animation was breathtaking, mushrooms dancing like Chinese dancers, hippos and alligators in elegant ballet, Mickey Mouse as a sorcerer's apprentice battling enchanted brooms. Walt hoped to make Fantasia a continuing series that would introduce new audiences to classical music. But Fantasia failed financially. Audiences weren't ready for such an experimental film. The technology required for the multi-channel sound was expensive and complicated. Critics were divided. Some called it genius. Others called it pretentious. The failure hurt Walt deeply. He had poured his heart into Fantasia, believing it would change how people experienced music and animation. Instead, it lost money and received mixed reviews. Then came Dumbo, 1941, a simpler, shorter film about a baby elephant with enormous ears who learns to fly. It was made quickly and cheaply, but it had incredible heart. The sequence where Dumbo visits his imprisoned mother, and she reaches through the bars to cradle him with her trunk, made audiences weep. Bambi, 1942, pushed realism further than ever before. Artists studied real deer for months, learning how they moved, how light played on their fur, how they expressed emotion. The forest backgrounds were so detailed and beautiful, they looked like paintings come to life. And the scene where Bambi's mother died became one of the most emotionally powerful moments in film history. But as Walt reached new artistic heights, the world fell into darkness. World War II had begun. World War and difficult years. December 7th, 1941, began as a peaceful Sunday morning in Burbank. The Disney Studios' palm trees swayed in the gentle breeze. Sunlight sparkled on the manicured lawns. Then news arrived. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. America was at war. Within hours, U.S. Army troops marched onto the Disney lot. They set up anti-aircraft guns on the roofs, turned the soundstage into a repair facility for military equipment, and stored ammunition in the parking garages. The magical animation studio had become a military installation overnight. The war years were difficult for Walt. Most of his animators were drafted into military service. Those who remained had to create training films, propaganda cartoons, and insignia designs for military units instead of the entertainment films Walt loved making. Walt himself threw himself into the war effort. He created Der Führer's Face, a propaganda cartoon starring Donald Duck that mocked Hitler. He made training films teaching soldiers how to use weapons, how to prevent disease, how to read maps. These films weren't glamorous or artistic, but they were necessary. The studio also produced Victory Through Air Power, a feature film explaining military aviation strategy. Walt believed in the project passionately, thinking it could help win the war. But the film failed financially and left the studio deeply in debt. Money became desperately tight. Walt had to lay off staff. The studio that had employed over 1,000 people during Bambi shrank to just a few hundred. The buildings that had once buzzed with creative energy now felt empty and echoing. But the hardest blow came in May 1941, before the war had even reached America. Walt's animators went on strike. Walt had always thought of his studio as a family. He knew his employees by name. He invited them to parties at his house. He gave them opportunities to learn and grow. When they turned against him, demanding better pay and working conditions, he felt betrayed. The strike lasted 5 weeks. Picket lines formed outside the beautiful studio gates. Former friends shouted at each other across the line. Police were called to prevent violence. Walt watched from his office window, his heart breaking, as his family tore itself apart. The strike ended with a union contract, but something had changed in Walt. He became more distant, less trusting. The innocent dreamer who had started with a mouse was becoming harder, more businesslike. The war finally ended in August 1945. Soldiers came home. The studio slowly recovered. Walt began producing the films he loved again: fairy tales, adventures, stories of magic and hope. But Walt had learned a painful lesson. The world was more complicated than fairy tales. Dreams were necessary, but so was protecting yourself, your business, your creations. He would never be quite as innocent again. Rebuilding and new dreams. The late 1940s and early 1950s were years of recovery and reinvention. Walt couldn't afford to produce expensive animated features anymore, so he adapted. The studio made package films, collections of shorter segments that were cheaper to produce. They released Cinderella, 1950, which became a hit and saved the studio financially. But Walt's mind was already moving in new directions. He had 2 young daughters now, Diane and Sharon, and he loved taking them to amusement parks on weekends. They would drive to places like Griffith Park in Los Angeles, where Sharon and Diane would ride the merry-go-round while Walt watched from a bench, eating peanuts. Sitting on those benches, surrounded by screaming children and bored parents, Walt started imagining something different. What if there was a place where parents and children could have fun together? A place that was clean, safe, and magical? A place where fairy tales came to life? People thought Walt had lost his mind. Stick to cartoons, Walt, they told him. Amusement parks were dirty, dangerous places run by carnival people. They were cheap entertainment for the working class. A rich, sophisticated man like Walt Disney had no business in that world. Even Roy was skeptical. "We're an animation studio," he argued across Walt's desk one afternoon. Light streamed through the windows behind him. "We make movies. We don't know anything about running an amusement park." "We'll learn," Walt replied simply. Walt began designing his park obsessively. He filled notebooks with sketches, a fairy tale castle rising above the park, a main street that looked like the Marceline of his childhood, different lands representing different themes: Fantasyland, Adventureland, Frontierland, Tomorrowland. He built a miniature railroad in his backyard, studying how trains worked, how they could transport guests around a park. Neighbors thought he was having a midlife crisis, building toy trains at age 50. Walt visited amusement parks across America and Europe, taking notes on everything: what worked, what didn't, what needed to change. He studied crowd flow, landscaping, architecture. He interviewed park operators, ride manufacturers, food vendors. Banks refused to loan him money for such a crazy idea. So Walt started a television show called Disneyland in 1954. Every week, millions of Americans tuned in to watch Disney cartoons, behind-the-scenes footage, and updates on the park's construction. Walt used television to raise money and build excitement. Construction began in Anaheim, California, on 160 acres of orange groves. The land smelled of citrus blossoms and fresh-turned earth. Bulldozers cleared the trees. Construction workers poured concrete, erected buildings, created artificial rivers and mountains. Walt was there almost every day, muddy boots on his feet, blueprints in his hands. He checked every detail: the paint color on every building, the height of every fence, the placement of every tree. Nothing was too small for his attention. "This has to be perfect," he would tell his construction managers, standing in the California sunshine, dust settling on his clothes. "This isn't just an amusement park. This is a place where dreams come true." Opening day and beyond. July 17th, 1955, dawned hot and cloudless in Southern California. The sun beat down on Disneyland's freshly paved streets. This was opening day, the day Walt's newest impossible dream would either succeed or become his final, spectacular failure. Everything went wrong. The temperature soared to over 100 degrees. The newly poured asphalt on Main Street was still soft. Women's high heels sank into it, and some came out of their shoes. A plumber's strike meant Walt had to choose between functioning toilets or working drinking fountains. He chose toilets, leaving guests hot and thirsty. A gas leak forced the closure of several Fantasyland attractions. The Mark Twain riverboat was so overcrowded it nearly sank. Counterfeit tickets flooded the park with unexpected guests. Instead of the expected 11,000 visitors, over 28,000 people crammed through the gates. Rides broke down. Food ran out. Lines stretched for hours in the brutal heat. Walt watched the chaos from different vantage points throughout the park, his heart sinking. He had worked so hard, invested everything, and opening day was a disaster. The press called it Black Sunday. Critics wrote scathing articles predicting Disneyland would close within a year. Walt sat in his apartment above the fire station on Main Street that night, the park finally empty and quiet, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. But something remarkable happened. Despite the chaos, despite the problems, guests had smiled. Children had laughed with delight meeting fairy tale characters. Families had made memories together. Something magical had happened, even amid the disasters. Walt spent the next weeks fixing everything. Rides were repaired and improved. More food vendors were added. Landscaping matured. Staff was trained and retrained. Within a month, Disneyland was running smoothly. And people came. Thousands, then tens of thousands, then millions. They came from across America, then from around the world. They walked down Main Street, USA, enchanted by the Victorian storefronts and the gentle steam train circling overhead. They gasped at Sleeping Beauty Castle rising against the California sky. They explored jungle rivers in Adventureland, frontier towns in Frontierland, space rockets in Tomorrowland, fairy tale rides in Fantasyland. Walt walked through the park almost every day, often incognito in sunglasses and a hat. He watched families, picking up trash when he saw it, making mental notes of what needed improvement. He talked to guests, asking what they liked, what could be better. Disneyland wasn't just an amusement park. It was a living artwork that Walt constantly refined and improved. New attractions were added regularly. Seasonal decorations transformed the park for holidays. Cast members were trained to stay in character, to maintain the magic. By the end of its first year, Disneyland had welcomed nearly 4 million guests. It was a triumph beyond anyone's expectations, except Walt's. He had known all along what was possible if you believed strongly enough. The final vision, Disney World. Success with Disneyland made Walt dream even bigger. By the early 1960s, he was secretly buying land in Central Florida, thousands of acres of swamps and orange groves. He envisioned something far grander than Disneyland, an entire vacation destination called Disney World. But Disney World was only part of his vision. Walt planned to build Epcot, experimental prototype community of tomorrow, a functioning city of the future where 20,000 people would live and work. It would have innovative transportation, clean industries, and advanced urban planning. Walt worked on these plans with an intensity that worried his family. He was in his mid-60s, but he pushed himself like a young man. He smoked heavily, 3 packs of cigarettes a day, the smoke curling up from his fingers as he sketched and planned late into the night. In November 1966, Walt appeared on television to reveal his Florida plans. He stood in front of maps and models, his eyes bright with excitement despite his obvious fatigue. He described Disney World, Epcot, hotels, golf courses, an entire resort destination. Here in Florida, he said, gesturing at the vast property, we have something we've never had at Disneyland, space. And with space, we can create something truly revolutionary. But Walt was sick. He had been coughing for months, increasingly short of breath. He finally saw a doctor who discovered a tumor in his left lung, cancer, advanced and aggressive. Walt underwent surgery to remove the tumor, but the cancer had spread. Doctors gave him months to live, maybe a year if he was lucky. He spent his final weeks planning Disney World from his hospital bed, sketches and blueprints spread across the blankets. Even dying, he couldn't stop dreaming, couldn't stop creating. On December 15th, 1966, at 9:30 in the morning, Walt Disney died. He was 65 years old. Outside the hospital window, Los Angeles went about its business under a gray December sky, cars driving past, people walking to work, the ordinary world continuing despite the extraordinary loss. Legacy, dreams that never die. Walt Disney never saw Disney World open, but his brother Roy postponed his own retirement to see Walt's final dream completed. On October 1st, 1971, Disney World opened in Florida with Roy cutting the ribbon, tears streaming down his face. This is Walt's dream, Roy told the crowd gathered under the Florida sunshine. We're calling it Walt Disney World so everyone will know it was his vision, his planning, his determination that made it possible. Roy Disney died just 3 months later, his final duty to his younger brother complete. Today, the Disney company Walt started in a garage has become a global empire worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Disney parks exist on multiple continents. Disney films have won dozens of Academy Awards. Disney characters are recognized by billions of people worldwide. But Walt's true legacy isn't measured in money or awards. It's measured in joy. It's in the child's face lighting up when they see Mickey Mouse. It's in families holding hands as they walk through the Magic Kingdom. It's in people of all ages still watching Snow White, still crying when Dumbo visits his mother, still believing in fairy tales. Walt Disney proved that one person with courage, creativity, and determination really can change the world. A farm boy who loved to draw became one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. A failed businessman who lived in an office with mice became a visionary who built kingdoms. He taught us that failure is not final. It's preparation for success. That dreams are not foolish, they're essential. That magic is real if you're willing to work hard enough to create it. Walt once said, "All our dreams can come true if we have the courage to pursue them." His life proved those words were true. From a Missouri farm to Hollywood studios to magical kingdoms, Walt Disney spent his life turning impossible dreams into reality. And in doing so, he gave the world something precious, the belief that dreams really can come true. Every child who laughs at a Disney film, every family that makes memories at a Disney park, every person who finds courage to pursue their own impossible dream, they are all part of Walt Disney's legacy. His body is gone, but his magic lives forever. The end. It's kind of fun to do the impossible. If you can dream it, you can do it. The way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. Walt Disney.